Hello, hello. Welcome to Kanban for everyone. Today we're going to be talking about Kanban for coaching Agile delivery. My name is Colleen Johnson. I'm the CEO of ProKanban.org. And today I'm joined by Julie Starling, Joanna Doyle, and Jennifer Steelman. Welcome, ladies.
Hi.
Hey.
Hello.
So today we're going to talk a little bit about how each of you have applied Kanban practices inside of your organization. And I thought this would be an interesting conversation for us to have because I think when a lot of people think about what it means to be a pro Kanban trainer, what they typically think of is selling classes and going out and offering public classes. And I thought it would be really interesting to hear from each of you since you're inside of an organization and using Kanban to help coach teams, coach scrum masters, coach leaders. You've all got kind of a slightly different angle on how you're applying what you've learned as a pro Kanban trainer to your companies and your teams. So let's just start with some introductions about who you are and where you are working. Julie, you want to go first?
Okay. So I'm Julie Starling. I am currently a practice manager for the Agile delivery community at Principality Building Society, which means I get to look after and support all the scrum masters and the delivery managers in the company across like 3 value streams and 13 teams. So that's what I do.
That's awesome. Thank you, Julie. And how long have you been a pro Kanban trainer?
It's nearly a year now that I've been an official trainer, but I've been a complete fangirl for years.
Original fangirl, Julie Starling.
Yes.
Love it. All right. Joanna, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hey, I work in the insurance sector. I am a senior scrum master in my company at the moment. So it means that I look after a few squads and also I support other scrum masters in their development as well. And I've also been a trainer for about a year as well. So been on the same trajectory as Julie as well. It's been wicked.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Joanna. All right, Jennifer.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Steelman. I am a large supply chain organization, and I am an Agile coach within the organization of the Agile Transformation Department. So I support multiple teams and the Scrum Masters for those teams, as well as I kind of the lead trainer, lead whatever of Kanban through the organization. And through that, we've been building up more expertise within the Kanban side of the house as well. And I've been a trainer with ProKanban for 3 years.
So maybe the original fangirl is Jennifer. She's going to take that title back, Julie.
That's fine. You can have it.
Well, it sounds like everybody's got some element of coaching or mentoring scrum masters in the roles that they have here. And I think it's an interesting time to talk about what kind of things that you've been able to help your scrum master teams, what skills you've brought to them and what things Kanban has really helped them with in terms of building up their skills and as a scrum master with their teams. Jennifer, I know you mentioned that your organization was pretty scrum centric. Can you tell us a little bit about how it's gone for you bringing those Kanban practices to your scrum masters? Were they like, we don't want to learn this?
I think it was more they didn't really see how it fit. There was a lot of long-standing, training that they'd had in Scrum, and they'd always worked in Scrum teams. So and ProKanban's approach as Kanban as a strategy is somewhat different than Kanban that they may have learned at previous organizations where it was either an either or. And so bringing that awareness in and starting to show teams how they can use Kanban as a strategy along with their Scrum practices and be fully Scrum as well as bringing in Kanban and how that can help them with communicating when things are going to be done to their stakeholders. It's helping to change the conversation that they're having. A lot of times, we talk in story points and Scrum, and that doesn't resonate to the business side of the house. So being able to have that use our historical data to forecast when something's going to be done and speak in the terms that people are used to, like, you know, dates and that sort of thing has changed the narrative in many teams.
Yeah, definitely. That's awesome. Julie, you said you're also coaching Scrum Masters and delivery managers, or managing Scrum Masters and delivery managers. How have you approached bringing Kanban practices to those folks?
So I guess it's been a bit of a mix over the years. So my first, I guess, introduction to all of this was probably about 7 or 8 years ago, when I saw like Dan Vacanti doing his hurricane talk and got really into the probabilistic forecasting. And we were on a big transformation program at the time where we were like struggling to hit the dates. They was flying by over and over again. And I think the probabilistic forecasting side of it really let us have brutal conversations around, well, this is how much it's saying we can get done, so what are we changing? So that was a really interest, and that was back when I was a Scrum Master myself. Now I kind of help and support the teams to be doing that with their teams, so on a variety of scales as well. So like whether they're just like sprint planning, or if they've actually taken the leap away from Scrum, because some teams have done that and some are trying to do a bit of a mashup as well. So I think it's about introducing it in a way to solve a problem rather than here's this thing you should try doing. And that's kind of how it's phased in for a number of the things, like including the flow metrics, defining workflows, all that great stuff. It's about using it to solve a problem rather than going, here, let's try Kanban.
Yeah. And have you found that means that each team is at a kind of a slightly different point in their adoption of some of the practices?
100%. And part of the great part of my role is I've got this obviously really cool team of people who are all at different stages, but we can share that back with each other as well. So if I work with sort of someone and they start trying something, I'll encourage them to bring that back to the group, and you find it sort of spreads that way. So it's not just me out there doing it, it's like cross-pollination, which is great.
Yeah, that's awesome. Have you had any teams where you've seen that maybe they've taken a turn or taken a path with something that you would not coach, where you've had to take a step back and let them, like you said, like let them try that out and see how it works?
So it's really interesting when you go from doing it yourself to coaching someone else, especially with a forecasting element, because I don't think it always comes naturally to people, especially if you're used to thinking in points and timelines. So I've seen some interesting interpretations of how you use your data for forecasting. So that's taken a bit of a, okay, let's look at this. Why may that or may that not be the right direction? And sometimes they have to try it and fail, right? And that's the best way to learn.
Yeah, absolutely. Joanna, you mentioned coaching leaders and coaching executives with some of these practices. Can you tell us more about your experiences doing that?
It's been fun. That's what I can, as a highlight. I think we also went through a bit of a transformation, and Scrum was the hot topic. And I think some of the leaders felt a bit trapped within some of what they would have perceived as rigidity, which is very difficult to say, rigidity. And Kanban just felt a lot easier. It's like we would have, I guess, portfolio stand-ups, and it's like the only thing I need to focus on right now is age. It's like, great, okay, there was a real nice clean conversation, and being able to coach through that conversation was a lot easier than trying to have loads of different things that I'm trying to fit into one individual session. And they knew that every time that I was going to be on a call, or people that I was coaching were going to be on a call, I'm going to be asking the same sort of set questions. And similar to what Julie was saying about data, just gives some really nice clean data points to go and look at. And I think that translated a lot easier for some of our stakeholders. So it's been really good.
From an education perspective, like when you're working with leaders to try to, whether it's portfolio Kanban or talking to them about work at the team levels, like I think one of the things I hear a lot is that there's a misconception at that level typically that work on a Kanban board can take as long as it takes, right? Or that there isn't enough structure, especially if you're going from Scrum to Kanban. Did you run into any of those, any of that thinking with the leaders you were working with?
Definitely, I think some of the apprehension around like, oh yeah, it can take as long as it wants to. It's like, no. That is, yeah, completely right. It's a misconception. And then I think regardless if you're in Kanban or any world, the stakeholder question you're going to get is, when will it be done? And coming back and as a trainer, being able to not only answer that question myself with the data, but then train other Scrum Masters to answer that question. That was so powerful. That's normally the question that we can't get an answer to. And I was so happy that Kanban could actually help me get there. And, you know, you might run into the, when are you going to be 100% certain? And like, were you 100% certain before we had this conversation? So yeah, it's been really helpful.
Yeah, I love that. Jennifer, you also mentioned executives, and I know in your organization we've had some conversations about scaling these practices. Did you meet any resistance as you started working more with senior leaders?
I'd say that yes and no. I mean, it depends of what their previous history was and what they'd used before. So a lot of times it's with Kanban, it's just as Joanna mentioned, you know, things, oh, we've tried that before, and it's just we don't know when things are going to get done. It didn't help. Or there's a conception that it's for operational or maintenance, you know, a different kind of team than development team. So it's helping to bring some of those. So I've helped to bring some of the concepts in and layering it into what they're doing today, and just kind of looking at what, you know, look at the data, sharing the metrics and having the tools to share the metrics for the teams, and showing how that can be used, how you're using historical data versus points that may not, you know, that don't resonate. But showing that using that historical data and being able to plot it out using Monte Carlo or something like that, that has really been what has been the most helpful.
I think all three of you have mentioned Monte Carlo simulations and forecasting. And I think, you know, like you said, Joanna, the question of when will it be done is probably the one that most leaders care the most about. But what other practices have you seen take hold with either your Scrum Masters or delivery managers in terms of other core Kanban practices that have been helpful?
For me, something that's been quite good is that whole defining a workflow and visualizing it at a feature level. So one thing that we've found quite interesting in the last 12 months is in sort of one area they've started doing that, and it completely shifted the behaviors of the people who were operating that system, because because we use it alongside Actionable Agile as well. There's that cool little tool where it can make the work items flash when they've not moved for so long. And people were so disturbed by seeing the amount of flashing and the amount of work that was in progress just by having a visual at a feature level. That was really quite revolutionary, to starting to have some really great conversations about how we improve flow.
So, that's awesome. I think that feature level is such a powerful place to apply those concepts, because it's where I think we almost like invest too much in the front part of that process in terms of bringing new features in, and not enough time making sure they're moving effectively out of the process. So there's always a log jam or a pile up somewhere in that workflow. It's a great thing to visualize. Joanna or Jennifer, how about you? Any other practices that have been particularly helpful?
I think setting clear policies for things moving through the workflow, and it's quite funny. I remember us having a conversation about setting them, and people are like, well, yeah, of course, that's really clear. It's like, well, no, I didn't know that. That's all these unwritten rules that actually it's kind of helpful to write them down. And then when you bring new people into teams, it's like, this is what it is, and you've already got it nice and there and visual for them. So that's been a real game changer for us, making those unwritten rules written.
Yeah, I've run into that same thing, and I think it's always a funny meeting to have, especially like just at a team level too, or a feature, at any level of your workflow. I feel like everybody gets in there and is like, "Why do we have to spend an hour talking about this? This all seems pretty straightforward." And then when you start talking about it, it's like no one, like you said, no one's on the same page. Everybody's operating under a slightly different set of assumptions, and it doesn't mean that work isn't moving, but it means that maybe different activities are taking place at different points of the workflow, depending on who's picking up those work items, and getting them all explicit is super helpful. Yeah, I see that one a lot. Jennifer, how about you?
Yeah, so just to add on a couple of, both of Julie and Joanna touched on this a little bit, but building on that workflow and using that as the start, like as to define how you're actively going to manage the work. I think actively managing the work is something that teams don't really get a good grasp of until they start seeing the different tools and we also use Actionable Agile, so different charts like the aging work in progress chart. And this is where Julie mentioned the dot flashing, like if it's been in the column for too long, but being able to use different things in there to bring that visual cue at another level, because sometimes it doesn't show up as well as we'd like it to in the Kanban board itself. For all the visual cues we try to give it, teams may still, like use their board a little differently. And so it helps to have that one thing that's set a certain, that metric that's going to clearly show how long things are taking.
Well, and I think like you were talking about with the workflow policies, Joanna, I think that kind of bleeds over a little bit into the whole visualization of work item aging, because as probably many of us know, like if something is aging in Jira, you get those dots across the bottom, but they're not super helpful on telling you like how big of a problem is this. I think they get darker as it ages more, but you still don't really have a concrete number for how long that's been in progress. And I like to create workflow policies around what happens if we hit our SLE or our service level expectation, because I think for a lot of teams, it's the same as like the column turning red. If you're over WIP, you just get kind of numb to it and you're like, yep, that's old. Acknowledging that, yes, that's too old, but what are we going to do about it? And that's another place where I think those explicit policies in conjunction with what you're describing, Jennifer, of visualizing the age become kind of a, I don't know, peanut butter and chocolate to me. Like you need both of those things. You need the signal and you need to have a plan for what happens when you hit it. So
yeah, you mentioned those dots in Jira, and I can't remember if it's like where the dots are full on all red. It might be like 30 days, but so 30 days and 300 days look the same at that level.
Yeah,
and that's a very different story.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's shift gears here. I want to talk a little bit about the Scrum Masters that you all work with more specifically. And I'm sure, it's no surprise there's a lot of Scrum Masters who have been laid off recently. I think the industry is kind of reeling a little bit from a difficulty in showing value as a Scrum Master and showing effectiveness as a Scrum Master. How or maybe if it hasn't, but has Kanban helped your Scrum Masters at all in improving their effectiveness or value to the teams that they work with?
I think it gives you such clear things to measure. So it's like measure these 4 things. How are you doing on them? And it gives you nice concrete conversation. Not only from a how. So then I can work with the Scrum Masters to say, how have you impacted the team that you're allocated to? But then also, it's good feedback for the teams as well. So teams have been running an experiment. How have those metrics worked for the experiment we've run? How are we working together as a team? So that's great. Our cycle time's going down. Awesome. And that's been really positive. And I think it's given things to impact as well. So it's given target focus. Being like, right, okay, can I look at the amount of work items that we've got in progress? That's given them something to go after and a bit more purpose and direction. So that's been really helpful.
Julie or Jennifer, how about for your teams?
I was just thinking of a way to sort of articulate it. I think it's almost a little bit broader than just Scrum Masters as well, because what I see is the the level of engagement from the teams in terms of monitoring this stuff is way sort of higher than it ever is when you're not using Kanban. And there's the whole classic, I guess, you get with the Scrum Masters. People think you do 15 minutes in the morning and then turn it for a retro, and I think it really sort of adds up. People quite often think that about poor Scrum Masters when the job is a lot harder than that and a lot more involved. But I think it's just another level of value and contribution that you're bringing to the table, and really bringing people on the journey with you with that.
I'd add to that, I think it goes with the metrics that you're bringing in and the attention on flow. It changes the conversation within. So for a Scrum Master and a Scrum team, it changes the conversation from bringing that stuff in at the beginning of the sprint and making sure that it's done at the end of the sprint, but also how it's flowing throughout, and where things are starting to take too long. And some of the tools don't always work in our favor, in that if something's deprioritized, it may be removed from the sprint, but it's still sitting out there in progress somewhere, potentially. And your charts are going to help you see that. So it helps bring in a more active role that the Scrum Master can bring to the team, and then that helps give the team different information, and being able to see how it gives them more. It helps get people more actively engaged in helping those the ticketing, like a Jira or a DevOps or whatever we're using, start reflecting where they're at in the process. Because we're spending a little more attention on that being part of the indicator of how close to done are we, like how are we tracking. I think it changes the narrative and gives a more useful tool or a more active conversation as well.
Yeah, it's kind of similar to what we were just saying with the feature side of things, right? We tend to spend a lot of time in planning work, and then, like you said, it all gets pulled in at the same time, and it's hard to keep tabs on the progress that we're making, or more importantly, not making, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's all just moving in a big blob. And often we don't know that we have a problem until the end of the sprint. So all of those tools you just described give us more active management of everything that's in progress every day. And I think that can be a shift, especially for product. I find product owners, I think, have an underrated shift to make in moving to Kanban practices. They're often the ones batching work and going to figure out, okay, what's the next highest priority for the team, and doing that in 2-week chunks. But I think when you start moving to more of a continuous flow model, it tends to be that you have to know every day, as soon as capacity opens up for my team, what's the next highest priority item to pull. So it's I think, a big shift. Do any of you work with any product owner roles, or have you experienced any of that transition from the product side?
Yeah, I would say that example I was giving around the sort of feature level view, that's probably where the most uncomfortable conversation happened, because it was visualizing probably a part of the flow that goes unseen as well if you look at a lower level. And there were some really tough conversations in there about should you be starting the next thing when you've already got so much stacked up that the team aren't picking it up yet. And there were some really hard conversations that people had to have in that space, but great conversations as well. Like, it helps you progress. But yeah, definitely, I think you're right. I think there's a different shift for them than maybe the rest of the team.
Yeah.
I've worked with a product owner that was like a couple actually, they've been incredibly engaged in Kanban, and I can't tell you how exciting work was at that time, and the flow of work, and the conversation, and then embedding that into the teams and then having that as the shared narrative. I've had a couple of like really good like double act product owner Scrum Master relationships where that's been the focus, and it then bleeds into all the ceremonies that you're having as well. So it's a bit like, right, stand-ups are focusing on age, and then retro might be what went over our SLE, and it just cements everything in the team. So having that, and that's, you know, as part of the our role as trainers, it's not just you automatically think coaching of the Scrum Masters, maybe coaching of the Agile coaches, but coaching those roles like the product owners, your alliance, that is a real game changer.
I would also add that it gives another, so I have a couple of things. One is that it gives another view, another way to look at how many big pieces of work, you know, like whether we call it epic or feature or whatever we're calling those higher levels in the hierarchy, how many of those are open and active at one time, and giving a shift towards aligning those to value and not having them set as just, you know, kind of buckets of work or containers of things. As before looking at that level, a lot of times we're just looking at the stories, and as long as the stories have those unique pieces of value, we often don't, teams often overlook that those higher levels of work, a higher level in the hierarchy, they might just be kind of a grouping. So it gives another conversation to have around those with product owners as well. Additionally, it gives another way of, I've worked with a team of looking at, you know, how to prioritize the number of things they have, you know, out there, not prioritization necessarily of the whole entire backlog, but just how big is that backlog and how realistic is it that you're ever going to get those things done? And when they become a year or two old, what value are they still having to hang on to them? Are the people that asked for them, do they remember? Have they found another solution? You know, has the environment, has the system, have the tools changed to where that's not even needed any longer? So you're just kind of holding on to this like, you know, old television you bought on sale that's no longer going to hook up to your streaming system or, you know, whatever it is any longer. You know, like it's not that, you know, like that kind of thing. But when you look at it as trying to put it into terms of that number of things, and you're starting to get the, you know, the metrics saying, okay, look, if we were to try to get this number of things done, it would take us 2 years. And we get things, new work requests coming in at a rate that's so high that it, you know, you're able to just keep up versus any of those things in the backlog. So being able to, you know, kind of have a different conversation around that as well. That's what I've found useful.
Yeah, that's awesome. You know, I think when we think about that prioritization game and kind of what you're talking about, where the backlog grows and grows and grows, it's like it becomes a little bit of a dumping ground for all the things that we could potentially do, but might not ever get to. And when we do the simulations in our Applying Professional Kanban course, one of the things I always love hearing students say is how much faster they can make decisions when there's less things on the board. And I think the same is true when we think about our backlog, right? Is stuff tends to move to the top, I think, sometimes because it's easier, right? Than sorting through all the stuff you could work on. And so it's like, how do we, I guess, lessen that cognitive load too for the people prioritizing the work at any level of our organization so that it's easier to decide what's the highest priority and you're not combing through 2 years worth of nice to have requests, right? They'll come back. I like that. Someone will yell loud enough. You've all talked a little bit about using a lot of these Kanban practices inside Scrum teams. And I'm curious, for each of your organizations, is it some teams are doing Scrum with flow metrics? Is it some teams are doing pure Kanban and have gotten rid of time boxes altogether? Is it a blend of all of that? Lee, how about for you?
Yeah, it's very much all of the above. So I would say nearly all of them are focused around flow metrics, but yeah, whether it's adoption of that alongside Scrum, some have completely gone, nope, we'll just do this. This is what works for us. So yeah, it really is a blend, and I think that's good, right? We got to do what works for the team. So.
Yeah. Was there fear in letting the teams decide that on their own?
So I've not actually ever made a conscious, hey, why don't you try this type thing? It's almost been like we share practices and knowledge, and the sort of Scrum Masters will have those conversations with the team, and it's almost organically happened where it has. And then you'll have teams going, well, if they've done it, maybe we could do it, and we could try that. And we like Joe was mentioning earlier, like that whole experimentation element of it is, well, just try it for a bit and see if it works better for us or not. So yeah, it's kind of organically grown, and there is, I would say, a mix in there right now.
Yeah, that's awesome. Joanna, how about for you?
Yeah, I think the same. I think when I look across the different teams that we're covering, all on their own journey, and that's fine. Because like Julie was saying, they like share best practices, and people will, because it's such a light framework. It's not like a right, okay, we've got to have a week of like Kanban implementation. It's like, let's just start here, and that's been really cool. And people are like, oh, okay, I can pick this up, and then there's not sorry, I can just see my sausage dog in the background. I haven't got so many stringent rules to apply. So that's made it really appealing. It's not a tough sell. So that's been really, really helpful. And definitely the organic sharing of like, oh, we could try that too. And that's been really nice to see.
Well, and I find sometimes leaders push back a little bit on the idea of like, okay, if we're moving to flow metrics potentially instead of tracking velocity by story points, but some teams are still story pointing, and some teams are moving to flow metrics. How will we balance that out, right? How will we be able to compare teams, even though we're not going to compare teams, but how will we track these different projects with different methods? Did you run into any obstacles with that?
Yes, and I think nervousness from other teams being like, oh, but it's going to literally be like, are there going to be a flow metrics leaderboard? I was like, that comes up, you come to me and I will delete whatever page it's on. And I completely understand why people would be apprehensive and think that way. And it's like, and then reinforcing this, it's not a competition, because all teams are different, and that's why it's so brilliant, because you'll see different things from different teams. And it's just thinking about the predictability lens, like I don't care what that team looks like compared to that team. I care that when we're communicating with our stakeholders, it's what kind of certainty can we give them, and then they're able to build better relationships with their stakeholders as well through that, and that's really cool too.
Yeah, awesome. Jennifer, how about in your organization?
Yeah, I'd say there's a mix as well. We have some teams that have been Kanban for a long time, and then other teams that have been Scrum for a long time. And then we've had some that have moved from Scrum to Kanban, some that are using Kanban with Scrum. So a mix of everything. We are starting to see where we're getting a little more momentum and seeing the value around some of the teams that have been focusing on how their work scales up to that next level and starting to manage it from there. So we haven't had a lot of that yet, like a board for that portfolio level or the program level or whatever. An organization, whatever your organization calls it, but that level up, we have a few groups that are kind of trying that now, and what that would, and seeing how that can help them gain a better view from the overall initiative or product standpoint of where things are, and they're starting to help them see where those dependencies and where things are really getting stuck through the process. So we have kind of layering it on. And under that, there's some teams that are doing Scrum still and some that are doing Kanban. So just a mix of it all.
I think, and am I correct? Your organization is using less for scaling?
No, Scrum at scale.
Scrum at scale. Okay. So I'm curious about that part and how that's fit in with some teams going purely to Kanban. Have you run into any obstacles where for one value stream or one portfolio or program area where those groups have said, well, we all have to do things the same way because of trying to deliver in one value stream?
No one has yet. I'd say a lot of those teams are still at that level, still primarily Scrum. They're more of the groups that are layering some flow metrics into their Scrum process. But we are starting to look at that in some of those areas as well. So how we can look at, and I think there are some teams that are, some have Scrum teams, some have Kanban teams, and some groups that are using story points and kind of forecasting out based on those story points. And the conversation has been, okay, so what about your Kanban teams? Are they adding story points? Or, and fortunately, in the conversation we had also, kind of that, well, all these teams are using story points today. They're still all Scrum, but there's this option that you can choose it by work item count as well. So I'm kind of starting to have those conversations of, how would that work with our team, with our group that is a mix of Scrum and Kanban teams. So just having that, changing the conversation and getting more people thinking about how things might fit or how they might apply different concepts to their process, as well as it becoming a little more flexible on whether the teams are Scrum or Kanban, because we did have it set for quite a while that any of the development teams would be Scrum, and then our shared services and the teams that kind of work with a bunch of different groups across the organization would be Kanban. And so we're starting to see a little bit of a shift in that as well.
Well, we've got, let's go ahead and open up questions in the chat here. So if you have questions for any of the folks here on the panel, please add those, and we'll start going to reader or to viewer questions here in a moment. But before we do that, I want to ask you each a little bit about what your advice would be for folks who are in similar roles as you are in your organization, whether they're coaching leaders or Scrum Masters or product folks. Where should they start? And what do you think is kind of a good place for them to get started with some of these practices? Joanna, let's have you kick us off.
I think in terms of when I'm communicating with stakeholders, data is the most powerful. So I would make sure that I'm getting all my data and then having those improvements or highlighting where there could be issues where I could make improvements, but I don't quite have the key to those locked doors right now. And just lean back on the simplicity. I remember when I was doing some training and I was like, right, okay, so read the Kanban guide. And so I was like, oh, it's like, have you read it? Because you'll know it's not a huge read. You don't need to sit there with 5 billion cups of tea. So I think lean on the simplicity of what you're trying to bring in, and then bring that with the metrics, and it just makes for a much more engaging conversation.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's probably one of my favorite things to talk about for folks that are brand new to Kanban too. And I spent some time, some of you got to hear me lament my experiences last year on a safe engagement. But one of the things that was really, really a struggle for me was hearing all the teams talk about how their data wasn't valid yet, right? We don't know how many story points we can get done. And it's going to take us an entire quarter of delivering this way to baseline our story points. And then one thing would change and they would be like, now all of this data is invalid. And so you see organizations move to things like normalizing points and coming up with a time equation for the points, right? So that they have a better understanding of that data. But what's amazing about what you just said, Joanna, is this is data you already have. Like there's no need to baseline. There's no need to start from scratch. Like you've been working, we can use that data as a starting point. And I think that's really exciting for a lot of organizations to go, oh, I mean, if you want to buy actionable Agile, that's definitely our preference, but you can get started pulling data out of the tools that you've already got. So as much as we want that tool, we can also start with whatever you have and get moving from there. I think is exciting for a lot of leaders. Julie, how about you?
I would say you don't have to stop doing anything. If you start doing this alongside, what I always find is we're in a really lucky position in that none of the teams use story points, and there was never a hard transition away. It was a here's something else you can do. It's almost like sparkly lights over here, and everyone has turned. And yeah, I would always just say, yeah, look at what you've got right now and start using it. And then you're not taking anything away from people. You're giving people more. You're giving people more certainty. And I always recommend that people do an exercise where they put all their data in a scatter plot and then they color code it by story points. And you will see you are wasting your time. I guarantee it. I've never seen a Teams come out nice. It's always all over the place.
Well, and I have heard some developers who, I think the majority of developers I've worked with have said that they're very happy to give up story pointing conversations. They're time consuming. They require a ton of conversation and a ton of upfront design and definition to get to the point where they feel comfortable even pointing the work. And then by the time you go to pull it, it's been aging in the backlog. It might not be relevant. They might not remember that conversation. The team might look completely different. So there's all of this stuff that happens between when we pull those stories into those conversations and when the team goes to work on it. But I do hear some developers say that that conversation is important to get them thinking about implementation details. So you said you guys never story pointed, Julie?
So we don't, so I should probably clarify that point. We don't use story points for estimation or any planning time-based. There are a few teams that will still use them to have that conversation for that very reason. Most don't, but there are some teams that don't want to let it go because in those sort of refinement sessions and when you're talking about the work, it's almost like a currency they've got to where they can go, oh, we need to have a conversation here. We're not aligned. And I absolutely think they have a use in that sort of case. If that's how you want to use them, I don't think you should be using them for anything time-based.
Yeah. Wonderful. Well, Julie or Jennifer, how about you? So what would your advice be to folks in similar roles as yours of how they could get started applying some of these concepts?
Well, Julie took mine that you don't have to stop anything you're doing. No, that's okay. So I'm like, where can I go from here? I would say one of the challenges that I see a lot of times is that people say, well, this is taking a long time. We have no control. It's a third party. It's another team. And to start shifting, now that you have this data that you're looking at, now you see how that's impacting what you're trying to do. What can you start changing? Like, how can you look at that differently? Maybe it is checking, what can you learn from it so that it's more at a ready state when you pull it in next time, so that whatever you missed in this situation, that does it translate to future items? Is it that you have a UAT person outside the team that somebody else is needing to test that, and just checking with them before you start it? Are they going to be ready? Hey, we're getting ready to pull your item in. Will you have time in the next week or so to test it? And a lot of teams that I've worked with before Kanban, they had nothing to start those conversations with because they weren't tracking in any way how long things would take. When you're starting to look at see what your SLE is and about how long things take, then you have a starting point for that conversation. You start seeing, hey, this typically takes these, we can 85% of the time we can get these done in 10 days or less. So let me reach out. Hey, in about 10 days, can you, be ready to test this? And if it turns out they're going to be on vacation or they're going to be in the middle of a big project or something and they're not going to be able to test it, maybe you don't pick that up yet. And so it gives different conversations around. So look at what's in the way now. What have they learned? What has the team learned to live with, and start seeing how this can be used to have different conversations.
Jennifer, I'm curious, did you ever have, or any of your Scrum Masters have scenarios where when they went to present that type of data to the teams to come up with an SLE or have a conversation around how long does our work typically take, that the teams didn't believe the data or said there's no way it takes us 10 days. That's wrong.
I'm sure I have. I'm sure I have. But typically it's more like, yeah, I see a lot of like optimistic, oh yeah, there's 3 days. And then we start tracking it, or we look at how long is it, we plug it into the scatter plot and see how long it's really does take. And they start seeing, a much larger number. Then that gives them an opportunity to, like, okay, so what we have this perception that it's this long, but we see it's taking like twice that much. What's happening? What could we do differently? So yeah, I have maybe not a disbelief necessarily, but a little bit of a shock.
Well, and I think we're always so optimistic, right? Or we're thinking just about our part of that process and not all the time the work sits too. And I think when we start thinking about the downside of estimating, right? Those are all the things that are so hard to account for, how long work is sitting in our process, or like you said, waiting to go to a tester or waiting to get deployed. And when we tend to think about time, we think about our contribution to that overall process, but not all the other stuff that has to happen. And so I think that can be the other piece too, is the disbelief that most of our work takes 10 days or less is because my part takes 2 days. I don't know why your part's taking so long. You're clearly doing something wrong. I'm done in 2 days. So I feel like that's always an interesting conversation with teams too, about how do we start to think about this as a system and not my work's done and the rest of you are slow, right? So it's
right.
kind of eye-opening, I think, when they're like, wait, or if the cycle time, for teams that are doing Scrum and combining it with Kanban practices and flow metrics, I think it's also interesting when we start looking at that data and our 85th percentile is above 14 days. It's like, that means most of our work isn't getting done in a sprint anyway. So what is that telling us, right? In terms of how we should be working, or maybe how frequently we should be planning or pulling new work in. So.
Building on that point, one thing I quite often see then is that you have your SLEs, which people may or not buy into, and they'll see an outlier and go, well, an outlier. They'll see a higher data point and they go, well, if we take that out, the SLE comes down, and you're like, but have you done anything to resolve that from ever happening again in the future? No, but it won't happen again. And it's like, oh. Yeah. So that's always a journey. So when you talk about shock,
don't show them how to remove that from your scatter plot.
Don't take any data out of your.
Well, let's go to a couple of our viewer questions here. So I hope I'm saying your name correctly. I think it's Kenzai. When applying Kanban on different levels, like feature or PBI, which one should you start with?
The most engaged one.
Tell us more about that, Joanna.
Yeah, I think I did not that mean to. I didn't mean that to come across facetiously as it sounded, but I think you find like the positivity of good workflow ripples, and people kind of get flow FOMO, which is nice. And I will be trademarking that term now.
Yeah, we're gonna have to get stickers with that.
Yes. So it's going to have to go. It's going to have to scale upwards, because you're going to get a team being like, oh, hang on, we're getting loads of features at this level that we're being asked to do in our backlog, and we're really trying to keep stringent on having a sustainable WIP. And then if you got it at the feature level, it might be, we need more work down here. So yeah, I think that conversation is going to have to happen. So yeah, just start with the most engaged team, and then just be prepared that you are going to have that conversation. So it's also going to happen not just from, I guess, like feature to story level, or however you're measuring your work, but it's going to happen moving outwards as well, when you think about upstream and downstream and different teams impacted too.
Love that. Julie or Jennifer, anything to add to that question or that answer?
No, I agree completely.
Same.
Flow FOMO. That's a good one. That's a good one. All right, our next question. Many have a mindset that Kanban is only for prod incidents and service tickets. Indeed, it is. How do we adopt and rate time to bring in Kanban rather than Scrum?
So we saying, I guess, how do we decide is the right time to introduce Kanban to the team, if I read it like that?
I think so, yeah.
I mean, I probably like what I said before. It's like looking for what problem you're trying to address, really, and we always approach teams in that way in terms of we've got this problem. Hey, maybe we should try this, or what options have we got? And quite often, the sort of strategy behind Kanban will help us solve a lot of those problems just by that visualization and the data element of it. So I would always start with a problem, and that's your best footing because everyone's feeling that pain.
Yep. Joanna or Jennifer, anything to add to that one?
I kind of I would push back on the that there is a time where it needs to be Scrum. I think, or Kanban. I think it can be Kanban at any type of work that you're doing. I think would fit. For me, it's what resonates more to the team, which is kind of a partner to, or where I bring that in from, is what Julie said. What are you trying to solve? Sometimes it's that the team is, pushing it up against, they're having a hard time seeing it one way or another, and bringing in the good practices around an alternative can help get them past a hurdle, whether it's story points or planning the work in the next 2 weeks or what it is. Trying Kanban, but trying Kanban not just as tracking tickets on the board that could take as long as they need, but trying them and bringing in, like managing how long things are taking and that sort of thing, can really help a lot to that end.
And I see a note here from Lucian. Hopefully I'm saying your name correctly. And I think you touched on something that everybody said here, right? Of how can you bring all of this together, just like Jennifer and Julie are saying too, of understanding what problem you're trying to solve and maybe starting with even just one of those flow metrics that you called out there. So whether it's work item age or looking at past cycle time data and starting there, I think it can be, all of those things can be a sobering motivator, right? Like we said, starting to look at cycle time data and go, oh my gosh, I don't think our work actually should be taking that long. Or there's, how do we fix this, right? Well, okay, let's talk about work item age, right? And so it kind of snowballs, I think, into those practices. So I think sometimes too, those flow metrics are a great way to like dip your toes in without even introducing the team to any Kanban practices at all, right? It's just starting from that data perspective and then being able to say what things could we change about how we're working that we might be able to do to influence those numbers as well. Let's see if there's any other comments or questions. I don't see any others popping in. Does anybody have any other questions for this amazing panel? Are there any tools except Actionable Agile that can be used to run Monte Carlo simulations with?
I believe there's a spreadsheet out there, isn't there? Apart from that, I've never seen anything, but I'm sure that's not true.
I know one of the other ProKanban trainers, Louis Philippe, has a tool called Pacemaker that I think also runs Monte Carlo simulations. But yeah, there is a spreadsheet that I would not want to create from scratch, but it does work. We use it in our applied metrics for predictability class as well.
Yeah, I've seen other spreadsheets, so I know there's multiple. It's possible to create it, but I wouldn't want to try.
Yeah. Well, before we break for today, I also want to acknowledge how cool it is that all three of you were graduates of our Women in Kanban Scholarship Program. Jennifer, I think you were the inaugural cohort. Is that correct?
I was, yes.
It's so awesome. And we are on our 5th cohort right now. Everybody just went through the course. We had 18 ladies through that one. It keeps getting bigger, keeps getting harder and harder to select applicants through the program. But I think it's amazing what you've all done with your professional Kanban trainer program and what you've been able to do with the organizations where you work. So I hope you all are proud of that effort. I think it's pretty incredible. I feel very lucky to have a journey with all of you. Go ahead, Julie.
Sorry. I was going to say we should probably thank you for the opportunity. It's been
Yes.
great, and we're like part of this awesome community now of people who we can always reach on for ideas and sort of thoughts. Just the whole ProKanban community as a whole, but the sort of women in Kanban sort of element on top of that is great. And so thank you for letting us be a part of it.
It'd be fun to do a women in Kanban get together at some point. I feel like we're due. The group is big enough now.
Yeah.
Somewhere on the beach.
That'd be awesome.
Yeah. We'll work on this. Well, thank you all for spending the last hour with us. Next week, we'll be joined by Joshua Karyevsky, who will be talking to us about how he uses probabilistic forecasting for rapid adaptation, both in priorities and in development work. So don't miss that. That'll be next Tuesday. And then we will be meeting with Denise Tills, co-author of Product Operations, in April. So stay tuned for both of those episodes. And thank you all for joining us today.